The title of our presentation is A Grounded Theory Approach to Understand Supply Operations and Logistics Resilience in Supply Chains. I've taken an example out of the nature, out of the human body to explain you what resilience is, because we in supply chain management also can learn from other disciplines how they handle resilience, because supply chain resilience is quite a new topic. It's not that old compared to other disciplines. And I hope a cartoon is the right thing to do to explain you resilience, because I thought a real picture is not that good for the conference. Here we have the example of a cutted finger, and a cut in your finger is also a disruption for your body. And when you think about, I think almost all of you had that experience already, and when you think about that disruption to your body, you don't have to think about that situation because your body already knows what to do in that situation. Every part of your body knows what to do and how to manage this situation and also how to handle it. You don't have to tell your finger, okay, there's a disruption, there's a cut in your finger, and you have to solve this situation. Almost all capabilities are already in your body, and even for a small child, the capabilities are there and you don't have to think about the situation. But the situation is different. If the disruption is a huge one, if the cut in your finger is deeper with a lot of blood losing, then you maybe have to support your body because he cannot handle the situation alone. Or if you take another example, if you break a leg, you have to support your body. You have to think about the situation and you have to provide support to your body to manage that kind of disruption. That means the bigger the disruption, the more support is necessary. And we thought about this example, and there are also a lot of different more examples, not only when you consider your human body, there are also a lot of examples in the nature. And we asked ourselves, okay, what can we learn out of the nature? And can we use this experience and patterns to convert it to supply chain management? That leads me to a short overview about the presentation. First, we want to discuss about definitions, because I think that not all of you are supply chain management experts. Then we talk about the motivation and the purpose of this research we have done together in the last years. Ila then will, as an expert in grounded theory, the used method, we'll talk about the methodology. And now I want to thank you for your question about the method, because Christoph Bode has presented a more quantitative approach and grounded theory is a qualitative approach. That means that we have done a research in the same area using different methods. Ila and I then will inform you about the findings we see so far, because the project is not finished yet. There are some issues which are not solved yet, and we have to do some further steps to finish the research. And Ila will then close the presentation with the conclusion. Let me first start with explaining what supply chain management is. Christoph Bode has explained it already perfectly, and I just want to give my thoughts about supply chain management. When you consider the whole supply chain, you can see there are a lot of different companies available, involved. You start with the raw material. There are a lot of different tiers involved, from the suppliers to the manufacturers, to the distributors, retailers, and consumers. And within that supply chain, there are different flows involved. You have the information flows between the companies in both directions, not only one direction. Then you have the goods and services, which normally flows from the raw materials to the end consumer, with adding a lot of costs and value in the different stages of the supply chain, involving the different tiers. And the other direction, then we have the cash flow, which normally comes from the other direction, starting from the consumer to the raw materials. And this was too fast. What is then now necessary in addition to supply chain management, that supply chain resilience, what we are talking about now, is important. you need disruptions. And you have also seen in Christoph's presentation the red flash, which reflects the disruptions due to the fact that the supply chain is not a short chain or a short network. The possibility that the supply chain can be affected by such disruptions is a quite high possibility that something occurs to your supply chain. What do you think? What are some kinds of different disruptions that can affect or can have an impact on supply chain? Do you have an idea about such disruptions? I just want to give you 3 examples. The first one is a rather new kind of risk which was not available 10, 15 years ago. It's a cyber attack, and it's one of those disruptions and risks which gets more and more awareness in companies and also in supply chain management. We have seen different examples in the last months. We have seen one example of a big cyber attack affecting not only one company, affecting a lot of different companies, small companies, big, huge groups in different industries. That means a lot of different companies in different industries can be a goal of a cyber attack. And when you consider the cyber attack 2 weeks ago, Maersk, one of the big container ship companies, still not in a normal operating condition, they still have problems due to that cyber attack which was realized. Another possibility of a risk or supply chain disruption is natural disasters. It's not a new one, it's quite an old one, but the impact is, compared to decades ago, a bigger one, because 10 years or 15 years ago, you can't imagine that an earthquake in Japan could have an impact on an Austrian company. And nowadays, the supply chain are connected worldwide. You have suppliers all over the world, and the vulnerability for a supply chain also increased a lot during the last decades. And the last example I want to give you is bankruptcies. You always have the risk of bankruptcies of suppliers, of customers, of other supply chain partners, and also the financial crisis, the last one we had 2008, 2009, is a big risk for supply chains. And supply chain manager has to deal with that kind of risks. Now I want to come to supply chain resilience. Christoph has informed us about supply chain risk, and supply chain resilience is very close to supply chain risk management. There you can also see the red flash that we have in common. That's the disruption. And let me explain supply chain resilience by using that figure. We have 2 axes. We have time and we have performance. And during normal operating conditions, the performance of a supply chain is very stable, with no huge decrease or increase. That's the readiness phase. Then the disruption occurs, and immediately the performance of a supply chain will decrease. There's a drop in performance, and in the response phase, the supply chain managers and involved supply chain partners try to manage that kind of situation. And we have heard about different strategies to come over that difficult period, to be able to respond fast to that disruptions. After a while, there's still an increase of performance, and that's then the third phase. It's the recovery phase. The supply chain gets to recover, and the performance of the supply chain will increase until they reach the same level they had before the disruption occurs, and then this leads to the fourth phase, which is the growth phase. That means that the good companies and good supply chains use that disruptive time to be able to get stronger out of that difficult time. In our research project, we have heard that companies use that time actively to hire people, to hire employees which would be normally not willing to change their employer. The better your company is, the better or the more they are able to hire employees in that phase. And another company used that phase to acquire companies, but because those companies who are not able to solve that situation very fast, they have a competitive advantage. There you can see that the response phase is quite shorter compared to the normal disruption profile. You are able to reduce the impact of the disruption, and you can start to recover earlier than compared to the normal supply chain. This leads me now to the working definition of the project. It reflects all I've mentioned by explaining you the figure about supply chain resilience. We have used the working definition of resilience as the characteristic of a supply chain to actively address changes, to withstand disruptions. That means that always disruptions or quick changes are necessary, then to return to an active operating state after facing a setback, and to survive and grow during and or after a disruption. And how companies or supply chain are able to do that? They are using traditional as well as specialized tools, and they proactively develop individual and organizational capabilities to manage that kind of disruption. And what we want, or we have addressed with our research project, is the last point. We want to discover which individual and organizational capabilities helps companies or supply chains to manage the situation of a disruption. Coming to the motivation of our research project, the motivation is threefold. We have one practical or two practical points that most of the companies or most of the supply chains have already got the experience of a disruption. 75% of a survey dealing with supply chain resilience mentioned that they had at least one disruption. 2013 and I think 2017, the number will not decrease, it will increase, that they have experienced more disruptions, which had also, for a lot of companies and supply chains, impact on customers, that the customers were not that satisfied, the companies were not able to satisfy the whole customer needs because of the disruptions, and of course it led also to a loss in performance. And when you consider a disruption is a quite short event, and the impact of such an event can be a huge one. One cyber attack, just 1-2 minutes, but the impact, when we take the Maersk example, the impact can have weeks or months. Then we of course have also one theoretical motivation, that we are now in a very volatile and uncertainty environment. The companies are connected with their suppliers all over the world, and the involved managers have to deal with that kind of risks, because that's crucial to survive. And I've already mentioned it, resilience in supply chain management is a quite new area. One of the first paper dealing with that topic came out 2004. And compared to other disciplines, it's a very new one, and that's the reason why we want to recognize pattern in other disciplines and check how we can use that experience and patterns to adapt and apply them in supply chain management. When you consider the context, we have seen the example with the Porsche, that more than 80% of the products are bought at supplier end. They have just contribute by 20%, means that outsourcing is a huge topic. And I have here a figure with 70%, and that's the roughly figure. 70 to 80% of the goods are purchased as finished good at supplier's end. Shortly, the purpose of the project, we wanted to explore the phenomenon of supply chain resilience focused on the upstream supply chain. That means we don't want to discover the whole supply chain. We have seen the figure with the different tiers. We just wanted to focus the research project on the upstream supply chain. And the current status is that a model emerged out of the interviews we have realized. Ila will inform you about that method later. And we see the model of resilience in supply operations in logistics supply chains, and one of the next step or the goal of the research is to develop a comprehensive theoretical model out of that. Here, once again, the scope of our research, we want to focus on logistics, operations, and distribution, resilience in supply chain, not the whole supply chain, and also not involving suppliers and customers. And now I want to hand over to Ila, which is an expert in grounded theory, and she will tell you more about the used method, the method we have applied for that research project.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's working. So the method we used for this research was called grounded theory research. Before I get into the details, I want to just ask from the audience, is anyone familiar with this qualitative research methodology? Has anyone used it? Okay, so you tell me, what do you think is the strength? Like, why should we use another perspective to look at a phenomenon? Excellent. So if you look here, we'll see if there is a limited knowledge basis, like Michael said, it's a newer research stream, and there is limited work that has been done on it. So even if we were to do, say, a survey research, we can only look for things that we know already exist. Grounded theory helps us uncover things that we don't even know may exist that relate to the phenomenon. It gives us really, really deep understanding into what managers do, why they do, and kind of builds upon the work that Christoph was describing. So once we know these strategies, then to flesh out those when they might be using the RAF versus RFA strategies. Because it relies on semi-structured interviews, it also helps us to really ask questions that emerge as we are talking with the managers. What that means is, in, say, for example, in a survey, once I've sent out a survey, I cannot collect any further information on why somebody responded a certain way. And this gives us the ability to ask follow-on questions and then really, really understand the phenomenon. So for this project, so far, we have 39 interviews. Each one of them was conducted in person at the location of the participant, which makes them feel comfortable. They're in their home territory, they're in their organization, they're in their office, which is the preferred way. You don't want to invite them. You may, but it's then your office and a little bit more formal. Usually, if you interview a person in their location, in their territory, they may have access to files, documents, information that they more readily are willing to share with you. We transcribed verbatim all interviews, and they're all big global firms. We can talk about more details if you're interested. And the way grounded theory works is you take an interview, transcribe it verbatim, and you start coding sentences based on what you think is interesting and related to, in this case, resilience. And then you start coding more interviews and start seeing patterns, like you say, well, this first manager was saying that when it's a really, really big disruption, then I want my employees to do something. I don't care what they do, even if they make mistakes, it's fine with me. In other companies, you hear, that's where you start seeing the cultural patterns. They say, no, 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 we are very, very collaborative. Unless everybody is involved and we have made a decision, then we do something. So then you are constantly comparing what you're seeing, trying to find out patterns, and try to explain how managers really deal with disruptions. When something happens, what process do they follow? In this case, what we are describing here is mostly what distinguishes one firm that is better at resilience than another firm that may not be that good at managing a disruption. So I will hand it back to Michael.
After Ila's short introduction to the methodology part, I want to present you now the findings, the first findings, and the model which appears at the moment out of the data. The findings are separated in three main categories. It's planning and executing, it is employee characteristics, and managing information. Then we have also contextual conditions and strategies. And I now want to present you one of each core categories, and Ila afterwards will present you the strategies and the contextual conditions and also the future research steps we want to realize within that project. Let me start with the first core category. It's planning and executing, and this core category consists of three properties. It's process capability, it's crisis escalation procedure, and process transparency. Let me give you just one example. We want to give the example of the crisis escalation procedure, how that appears in the data. And in italics, you can read and see the quotes we have taken out of the interviews, and these are the codes we have used. There was one interview participant who has mentioned that they have an escalation procedure in place, and they then organize this process in an interdisciplinary special task force, how they call it. And there are different departments involved, means that not only one department will solve the situation. They take a team which is out of the daily business, and they have to deal with that kind of disruption. Another one mentioned that it's important to be flexible and to have short communication channels to be able to decide fast. Speed, velocity is one important aspect, and that hierarchy is not helpful. That means they need a second organization to be able to solve disruptive situations fast. Next core category is managing information with also three properties. It's relevance, it's IT support, and it's velocity. We have called it velocity. I think it's the same as speed, as you have mentioned. And here also we have various examples how velocity appears out of the data. Once again, the connection with the task force, that it was the right thing to do, that they have organized it in a task force, and it helps the company to react fast and quickly. Then another one mentioned that it's critical to react as soon as possible in the beginning of a disruption. Third one mentioned we are one step ahead because we are quicker and more flexible. And here, once again, we have the competitive advantage. The quicker a company can react to such a disruption, the better they can manage that situation. When you think about, once again, that example of the earthquake in Japan, if you have a supplier in Japan and you just recognize it 2 or 3 weeks after the earthquake, maybe you are not the fastest, that your supplier is impacted by the earthquake. That means the faster you get that information, the supplier in that area where the earthquake happened is impacted by the earthquake, the better you can manage that situation. And the third core category is employee characteristics. We have named it employee characteristics, but we're still not that happy with that definition. It has, at the moment, 7 properties. It's tenure, it's training, it's trust between staff and managers, it's informal networks, it's diversity of experience, and once again, experience, but within the company. And the employees, the involved employees, have to be stress resistant. And stress resistance is those property I want to explain more in detail. Maybe there's a strong connection to velocity and speed because they have to solve that situation very fast. It means the employees also have to be stress resistant to be able to manage that situation. Now I want to hand over to Ila to explain you the strategies and contextual conditions which are also involved in the project.
really quick to put everything what you heard so far in perspective of what does it mean for supply chain resilience. What this means is that these core categories, I'm using technical term from grounded theory, the 3 core categories of planning and execution, employee characteristics, and managing information, and all the properties you see under them, for example, under employee characteristics, tenure, training, trust, informal network, experience, etc. They explain the difference between less, medium, or high resilient firms. So the ones that have more of each one of the properties of these core categories are likely or expected to be more resilient. Well, to test that, we might need to do a survey, but this is what emerged by talking to the managers. So then one would say that if there are a certain number of companies and all of them are doing a really good job of planning and executing to be resilient, managing information, and training their employees on all these aspects, then would we expect all companies to be able to react, to be resilient in equal amount to a specific disruption? Well, the answer is no. Different companies would have different reactions, even though they may have similar type of resources. So that's where our strategies and contextual conditions come in. They explain why, if every company is focusing on all these things, why their performance when there is a disruption may be different. So I'm not going to get into details of each one, but really quickly, if a focal firm, the firm that is impacted by the disruption, is aware of their partner capabilities, then they can better make use of those in resilience. So which is very different than one company telling us, we are calling our suppliers to figure out what can and can't they do for us, versus another company that is already aware of what are the capabilities of the supplier and telling them, do this for us. So you see how these would be different. Another one is partner characteristics. So it is one thing to be aware of what your suppliers are capable of, what their capabilities are. There's another thing that how quickly, how agile your suppliers are to react to those changes. So you may have a perfect planning execution, you train your employees, and you have really good suppliers, but they're not flexible. So it might be worthwhile to work with suppliers and help them improve their flexibility capabilities. And I'm going to pick just one more from an interaction perspective, which is also something very interesting that came out of the interviews, that suppliers would say, well, if a customer always treats me very transactionally, just like a vendor, then I am not that willing to do anything for them during disruption. However, this is not a supplier, but a customer saying we treat our suppliers like our partners, so if something happens to us, they really make sure that we are together in the disruption and they help us come out of it. And then this is an area we are trying to still work on, which is strategies for dealing with disruptions, making organizations more resilient. So first one is obvious that there needs to be improvement in all of the 3 categories. Again, I'm not going to get into details of every single one, but let's say, which one should I pick? Because we have been talking about reactively and proactively managing risks. So for resilience, it lies on the risk spectrum. One thing could be to invest in proactive management capabilities, which would be, I know what should be done when a disruption happens, so I'm going to get ready. I'm going to aim, take time, and then fire, versus should we become better at reacting. When something happens, we should know at least the basic things we need to do. Something happens, fire, and then we figure out what else needs to be done around it. So this is what the full model looks like. And we continue to work on understanding more of the categories. We still have questions that we have not answered yet. Well, thank you very much to the audience for participating. Appreciate it.